So, should you scan yourself, or should you have the lab scan for you? It's an age-old question. Let's figure out which one's best for you. So I'm making this video because someone commented on my how to buy a Nikon Coolscan video and asked me to do a side-by-side comparison. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to look at the quality difference between the lab and the Nikon Coolscan and figure out what's the differences here. If you're at all interested in the film stocks that I use for these images, you can click the links down in the description and it'll bring you to a page where you can get some of them. But let's look at a side-by-side comparison of the lab versus the Nikon Coolscan. Okay, so here's our first image that I wanted to look at. It's a very simple image, but I think it gives a good comparison about our first thing that I want to talk about, which is color. Both of these images are unaltered from the Coolscan after it ran through conversion software and then straight from what the lab gave me. The first big difference we can see is the color. I really love how the Nikon Coolscan retained a lot of its color from what I remember the image looking like when I was there in person. The oranges and even the greens of this image from the Nikon came out so much prettier than the lab scan. These highlights look washed out and it overall has a really purple magenta kind of color cast to it. When we zoom in over here as well, you can also see the loss in sharpness. So this image from the Coolscan, you can actually see the grain that it's picking up from the actual texture of the film versus the lab scan here. And it's actually much flatter. And you can even see some scratch marks that got left behind. But even when it comes to the pattern in the curtain, the Nikon Coolscan picked that up so much better. Another image that shows some retention in light is this one here. You can see the Coolscan on the left. It kept its highlights so much better than the scan from the lab, particularly up here in these clouds that in the lab scan has a really magenta tone to it. And the same thing here, if I zoom in, you can see how much sharper the Coolscan is than the lab scan. This might not be a difference that shows up really noticeably on like an Instagram post, but it would show up when you actually print the image. Now let's look at two images that show a huge contrast in color. Again, we have the Nikon Coolscan on the left and the lab on the right. With the Nikon Coolscan, the saturation looks really great. It actually looks like it's somehow turned up without looking like it's Photoshop turned up. It just looks really naturally beautiful, like it was the day I took the photo. With the lab scan over here, everything kind of seems overall washed out and white and somehow contrasty and muted all at the same time. Just to show again, the sharpness on the Coolscan over here on the left is absolutely better than the one from the lab. When you look at something like the white in this part of the flower, it's blown out from the lab. Or when you look at the details and the leaves down here in the bushes, the Coolscan just retains so much more of its detail. I could zoom this in a whole lot more and you can just see the detail that's here, even though it's starting to get lost, but once you zoom all the way back out, it just reminds you of how sharp the Nikon Coolscan is. The last image I want to show here I think is the best showcase of everything that we've been talking about. You can see an absolute change in the density of this photo. Everything from the shadow detail down here by the buoy to the actual colors that are retained in the boats. There's a huge difference between these two images. A great example of the sharpness of the Coolscan, you can actually read that this says Friends Douglas House on it. And honestly, I don't think that I could make out what the lab scan actually reads as. Now you might be saying, well, why don't you just edit it a little bit, get some of those colors back, bring the shadows back a little bit. And I wanted to show you my edited version of this photo. And so here's about as close as I could get to an edit that looked similar to the photo from the Coolscan. It's not a bad image. I think it looks great, but we still need to remember that the loss in shadow detail is still there. When I look down at the shadow of this image, there's nothing left. But when we look at the Nikon Coolscan, we have so much more information left in the shadow. Now, granted, there's parts of this that need to be cleaned up. This might be underexposed a little bit, just as an image in general. But the difference between what the lab was able to do versus what I was able to do with the Coolscan is really evident here. This image is a great example of what it looks like to have a really great scanner at home. And when we think about what the lab gave me initially, compared to what I was able to scan at home, with hardly any adjustments to it at all, there's no comparison between these two images. I've been so happy with my Coolscan. But I also want to look at how it makes sense financially as well. So I've done some math for us as well. I wanted to look at the cost of a cheap Coolscan, an expensive Coolscan, which is the one that I have, versus lab processing and scanning. So when we look at a cheaper Coolscan, it costs about $400 plus the software that you need to run it to be able to have a good in-home setup. For me, it was really important to get a 4000 or a 5000 that had full roll capacity, and so I spent the extra money to get that. Now, I will say there are some softwares out there that are free, but I've had ViewScan installed on my computer for a really long time. I just wanted to be upfront with factoring in that cost as well. And these numbers might look different from your lab, but this is based off of my lab here in London. I'm really lucky in that I have a lab that does really cheap processing, but they do really expensive scanning. And the difference between a low res and a high res image is insane. And so when I do processing and scanning with the lab, I'm looking at somewhere between $13.50 and $19.50, depending on which resolution of scanning I'm getting. But when I scan at home, I'm looking at about a cost of $5.50 per roll, plus the additional cost of the scanner and the software. So I crunched some numbers for us, and to compare a high-resolution lab scan versus the 4000 with software, you start to save money after 52 rolls scanned. If you do a low-resolution lab scan, compared to the Nikon LS50, which is their cheaper model, with the additional software, you start to break even after 50 rolls. But then I think this is good to point out as well, if you compare the high resolution lab to the 4000 with no software, or you use a free software, you start to save money after 43 rolls scanned. And then you can see here the low res lab scan versus the cheaper model, and no software or free software, you start to save money after 65 rolls scanned. So for me and my lab here, for the cheap processing that I have, for the software that I already had installed, and for the quality of images that I'm looking to get, it really made a lot of sense for me to get the Nikon Coolscan 4000. It really matches my desired workflow of being able to scan a full roll at a time, and the sharpness and the color that it's giving me compared to the lab is like nothing else. Alright, so I hope that video was helpful. For me, the lab just doesn't compete with the Nikon Coolscan. If you can scan at home, you're going to be so much happier with your images. Not only the image quality and color and sharpness is better on the Nikon Coolscan, but eventually the price becomes better too. And if it's worth it to you to have a better quality image, it's worth the extra money that you can spend to buy a Coolscan. Just to remind you, there's some links below to some film stocks that I think are really great, really give you some beautiful images, so feel free to click those. And if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. And if you have any suggestions for other videos that I can make about the Nikon Coolscan, questions about how that works, let me know. I'd be happy to make another video. See you next time.